Okay. So, today is October 21st, 2017. It is 2:25 p.m. This is Luciana Spraker, representing the City of Savannah's Research Library and Municipal Archives. I am interviewing Nick Palumbo for the City of Savannah's Ardmore History Roundup Day project. We are conducting this interview at the historic Gould Cottage, now part of the Habersham School. Today we will be discussing the history of the Ardmore neighborhood and the surrounding community. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Palumbo.
Thank you.
Let's start by having you tell us your full name.
Full name is Nick or Nicholas Palumbo, Papa Alpha Lima, Uniform Mike Bravo Oscar.
Do you have a military background?
No, but I've had to spell it so many times. I was a police officer before I moved here and had to learn that phonetic alphabet. So it always gets confused with Columbo or misspelled, so I rattle it out there.
You've learned a lesson.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, so when and where were you born then?
I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, or a suburb of it called Kenner. And I lived there until I was about 13 years old and moved to Mobile, Alabama. Graduated from the University of South Alabama, undergrad, with a degree in history and business, and then took a job with the U.S. Park Police in Washington, D.C., and I lived there for a couple of years. Joined the U.S. Foreign Service, met a woman from Savannah, Georgia, and while I was down here in training at FLETC in Brunswick, Georgia. And that was the first time I got to see Savannah, and I loved this place and worked my way back to it, and now I live here on the 200 block of East 51st Street.
Okay, good. Let me just back up and capture one question we missed. When were you born?
November 11th, 1984.
Okay. So I think you mentioned this, where you live now. What is your address?
It's 216 East 51st Street.
Okay, and what neighborhood is that in?
It's in Chatham Crescent, but it immediately is adjacent to Ardmore, is right across the street.
Okay, and when did you become aware of the Ardmore neighborhood?
I became aware of the Ardmore neighborhood as soon as I chose this neighborhood. I sought it out. I wanted to live in a stable and historic neighborhood and a place that I could afford. And I took a look at the National Register districts, and I noticed that it was kind of this split. I didn't learn until at least a couple of years ago that a place called Ardmore existed. I knew that there was a chunk that was immediately adjacent to Ardsley Park and that was south of Chatham Crescent. Clearly it must have existed, but it wasn't really until I became the president of the Neighborhood Association. I was digging through all of our archives, which is just an entire file folder of papers from when our Neighborhood Association was established in 1992, to find that there was this separate neighborhood. And there were all these meeting minutes talking about the inclusion of Ardmore into our Neighborhood Association. So that's how I kind of became aware of it.
So what is the title of your Neighborhood Association?
The official title is the Ardsley Park and Chatham Crescent Neighborhood Association. And one thing, part of what got me started as soon as I became president of the neighborhood, I was inspired to finish a National Register nomination for this neighborhood because I felt that, it's very large. It's, I believe, over 300 or 400 homes, and it should be adequately represented in our title. And I got some pushback from members of the association in saying that, well, Ardsley Park and Chatham Crescent are on the National Register of Historic Places, but Ardmore is not. So until Ardmore is on that National Register, we're not going, there was this pushback of this identity crisis. And in order to rectify that, it's getting some of these things started, like the history roundup that we're doing today. And Dr. Williams and his architectural history students are doing a survey of the neighborhood to try to prepare that application.
So you mentioned in the records you found stuff about the association talking about Ardmore. Did you find a specific point where they decided to include Ardmore in the activities of the association?
Yeah, there was an official vote, and it was either 1991 or 1992 when they're drawing the borders up very early on in the Neighborhood Association, one of the first meetings, and talking about where are our borders going to be, who should we include. There was an immediate push to include Ardmore in the neighborhood because of its shared common heritage with being developed by the Lattimore brothers and its shared architectural history. So like my house was built in 1928. It's outside of Ardmore, but it's in the same vein. It's the same builders. that built in Ardmore. So there's this blending of architectural styles between the two neighborhoods, and you've got certain consistencies, like you're extending the landscaping plan on 53rd, 54th, and 55th Streets into Ardmore that continue on from Ardsley Park. So I think early on, looking at the materials and the style of architecture and the shared common heritage, there was a big push by the Neighborhood Association to embrace them and to capture them. And I think if they could go back in time, our nomination to the National Register for Ardsley Park, Chatham Crescent was in 1985. So that's about 6 or 7 years before the Neighborhood Association starts going. If they could go back in time and reevaluate it and do it all over again, I think they would have tried to include Ardmore in that nomination, but that's something that's kind of lost to time. I'm not sure why they didn't do that.
So you see in those early days of the association, they embraced Ardmore into their boundaries. Did you see any discussion about their naming, why they didn't embrace the name Ardmore at that time and the naming of the association?
There were lots of different memos, and the naming convention of the association changed over time. For the first couple of years, it was only the Ardsley Park Neighborhood Association. And there's a memo that I have from the president at the time that says, we don't need to confuse anybody. You know, this is the Ardsley Park neighborhood. And there were lots of discussions over borders. That continues today. There's almost an obsessive level of discussion over who lives where and then what. But they, at first, for the first many number of years, it was just the Ardsley Park Neighborhood Association that was included in our branding. A couple of years in, there was a change where Chatham Crescent felt left out, and the citizens that lived in Chatham Crescent wanted to be included in the namesake. So now we are the Ardsley Park and Chatham Crescent Neighborhood Association. And I think what we're trying to do here, what I would like to see, is to have Ardmore included as well in that naming convention, so that they feel included and feel a part of it, because this is a huge part of our neighborhood and neighborhood association.
So when I first moved to Savannah, I think I recognized early on Ardsley Park, but didn't realize Chatham Crescent was Chatham Crescent. I thought it was just Ardsley Park, and I wonder if, and I think a lot of people do too, and I wonder if some of that doesn't carry on to that sort of idea that Ardsley Park Neighborhood Association early on was just Ardsley Park Neighborhood Association, but really it was Chatham Crescent and Ardmore, this sort of the way we simplified things, just simplified away some of those other neighborhoods.
Certainly, yeah, that it's tough because it starts this, it's strange, south of Victory Drive or Estill Avenue as it was, like it's more than just a neighborhood that's built, it's almost like an identity that's built up, and the concepts that are generated are on the same level that maybe this is a little too generous, the same level that Oglethorpe had in their practice. Like the Lattimore brothers wanted to do a 20th century variant, and they wanted to have a very cohesive neighborhood with all of these squares and everything, the attention to detail was just unparalleled. Even the sidewalks, there's a checkerboard pattern to the sidewalks there, and where they place the houses, how big are the lots that face in, there's a modified truss lots there, and so they have that level of detail with tree lawns. Then you cross over Habersham, and you've got its own identity for Chatham Crescent, which is a city beautiful plan, and it's got Chatham, the actual crescent, and these palm line malls, and a big centerpiece that was going to be a hotel in the middle with these circular parks. So they each have their own rich identity. I think it's important to recognize each of them as their own, because they were thought of in an entire concept. Like this neighborhood, the centerpiece of it was Hull Park, you know, and that from day one, I mean, that was a gift from the Lattimores to the city. And there's a memo where they say, you know, please accept this gift of this multi-acre park, which is immensely generous for a developer to give away land to the city. But it was all part of these bigger concepts. If you look at the advertising and the literature for Ardmore in particular, you've got these Duesenberg style cars and Mediterranean cottages, and it was right around the time when the movie Robin Hood came out, so that was a big part of the motif as well, so that you could have your own little castle in this corner of Savannah. So it's all like, it's an interesting take on a piece of your built identity and heritage in each little part of the neighborhood.
So when you look at the plan of Ardmore, it's a little bit odd that Hull Park is in the corner rather than in the center. What do you think about that?
I think that the Lattimores were young when they did Ardsley Park, and they were still young when they did Ardmore, and I think they saw the opportunity in having access to this park and having it there that would spur development in all other sections and kind of use it as a hub, and there would be these different spokes of neighborhoods that would surround it. Because I know later on the Lattimores did Lamara neighborhood, which was for Lattimore, Ma, and Ra, which were two masons or builders that were part of it, and they combined them together. So they had intentions to continue building southward, and I think they saw this as like the centerpiece that would generate more attention into that development. And I know, at least for this neighborhood, the lots that went for sale, they were advertised in the Savannah Morning News. If you purchased them on the first day, you got a 10% discount. And the following day after the sale had occurred, they released in the Savannah Morning News that every single lot had sold in one day. You know, so the demand to what they called the most choice section of town was insanely high to sell an entire neighborhood in just one afternoon.
What are some of the important leaders or prominent citizens that you've learned about that were from Ardmore or impacted Ardmore?
And just walking around the neighborhood in the past week, I've been flyering and going door to door and kind of shaking the tree to get folks out. And there's none that I knew personally, but the claims that I've heard is that the Dunn family grew up here, that there was a connection to Ted Turner's family, that the Turner family worked for a man named Mr. Price, who was in outdoor advertising. There was of course, Hull Park was named for Mayor Hull, and Mayor Hull's daughter, I know, lived in the neighborhood here. And let's see, that's all I can think of off the top of my head.
Have you heard about any significant events taking place in the neighborhood?
These were, it's interesting, other than, you know, the local events here, because it's always been just a primarily, it always has been residential neighborhood. I've never seen or heard of any big events happening in Ardmore itself. Just the people, this was always a place to come home to.
Okay. What have you heard about Hull Park and maybe how it's changed over time?
Well, I know from the drawing, the initial drawing was it was going to have trees running north and south on Atlantic, and then trees running east and west on 55th Street, and that would kind of divide it into 4 quadrants. I also know that there used to be a basketball court, and right now we have a baseball diamond, a playground, a couple of swing sets, a pavilion where people have birthday parties, and then a concrete amphitheater, which is pretty interesting. It looks like it has a 1940s or almost Art Deco feel with fountains that are coming out of it that are made out of concrete. But I also know that from a neighborhood association perspective, there was a basketball court here that the neighbors to the properties about 15 years ago didn't like people using it. The lights were very bright, and they petitioned to have it removed, and they were successful in that.
Where the basketball court was, what did that become?
That's now, it's a grove of cypress trees there that's kind of in the center, which is nice. Every fall it drops, and it's, you know, but they're getting up about 15 years there in age.
So today we're meeting in Gould Cottage. Do you know anything about the history of this building?
I do. Now, you probably heard a lot more about the early history. I know from the Neighborhood Association records that starting in about 2012, we start having lots of meetings about the fate of this cottage. It goes up for sale, and it was going to be a whole mess of different things. One person came in to pitch it. It was for sale for $525,000. That was the asking price, lock, stock, and barrel for the whole lot and the home. And there was somebody approached the association about turning it into the Ardsley Park Country Club. Somebody approached about turning it into a commercial property that was going to have 80 parking spaces, but that was turned down. And then there was a third that I can't remember, that was going to be a different iteration where they were just going to only maintain the facade and then build out, just kind of try to build out the rest of the back. And those all kind of fell through. Either they met with opposition from the neighbors or the neighborhood association itself, because we really recognize how important this is as a residential community. And then the Haversham School came along and said that they wanted to, you know, start this classical private school. And, you know, the neighborhood association, I mean, it's just a perfect fit for it. We're super happy that it gets to be utilized and have such a respectful owner of the Gould Cottage.
So, Savannah has so many unique and rich neighborhoods. What do you think makes Ardmore a special neighborhood out of all of them?
Ooh, Ardmore is really special because it was the first modern, I would say really the first modern neighborhood in Savannah, in the sense that, you know, I've got, my wife and I manage a dog walking company, and so we get to go in a lot of these houses and see their floor plans and their layouts, and they're still very functional today. Even though they were built in 1925 and 1930, you know, you're still going to see a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. They're going to be modestly sized, but they've been unaltered over time because they still meet the needs of folks today, because we're still reliant on the automobile. And it was designed with the auto in mind, so we haven't seen some of the drastic kind of changes in this neighborhood, and it's so intact because it still meets our needs today. You know, it's still primarily an auto-driven neighborhood. Like if you wanted to get to work, you're probably going to have to drive, and there are not too many alterations to the property. So even though it's got this really neat 1920s, 1930s vibe, you know, it's still intact, that it's very close, if not identical to what it was when it was built.
Cool. Anything else you want to share with us about Ardmore?
That's it. I'm just happy to be here. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for sharing your memories of Ardmore and Savannah with us today.
Thank you. Yay.